Welcome to the Treachery of Data podcast, the companion podcast for the CRO Roundtable, a bite sized chunk of content summarizing a recent roundtable discussion topic. Okay, so we have a guest podcast person with us today to discuss.
Nice.
Yeah, I know. We're really good at this
Quick
stuff.
intro.
We're very
Fellow
professional. Like
podcaster, something like
already
that.
going off the rails, right? We have notes that I'm totally not
We
attention
have a
to.
fellow human.
Fellow
Yeah.
human, yeah, I'll
Fellow
take it.
human. Yeah,
I'm like 75% human. Sure, we'll go for that.
that's better than us, actually.
Well, so anyway, yes, we've got Tracy. You want to give yourself a quick little bit of intro?
Yes. I'm Tracy. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I am a fellow experimenter. I have a few years of experience running conversion optimization programs, both in house and agency. I love it and have kind of taken that interest in the field to a podcast that I run with your pal, Shiva Manjuna. It's called From A to B. And we pretty much try to take these really big philosophical conversations about experimentation or things that we don't think enough people are talking about and just really shoot the shit and tell it to our listeners straight. Been an awesome experience and I'm really happy to be on this episode to kind of take that further with you guys.
It's great to have you on. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the show as well. It's a really good
Thank you.
show. People should check it out.
Thank
They
you.
should definitely listen to that one and not this one.
Yeah. If you're listening to this one, just stop
Yeah,
and just listen to the other one.
I'm a little biased, but if you
no,
stop
there's
listening to
there's
this,
plenty of space. There's plenty of space for everybody.
there is.
Me and Iqbal, we like to get pretty technical about stuff, which is one of the reasons why we're experimenting with bringing in more people to have different takes rather than just me and him
Yeah.
agreeing about something all the time. So, all right. And now, what are we going to discuss today? So, when it comes to A/B testing, the number of changes you can employ in a variation could vary considerably from one change to many different changes all bundled together. You can cause testing big versus testing small, making big bets, making small bets, bundling, iterative changes, etc. So first, let's kind of define, like what is the difference between like a big bet versus a small bet, right? Because it's not always necessarily like degree of change that you're making.
There's different
Right.
ways that something can be big. Development time, resource time, that's one of them. There could also be a subjective opinion about the size of a change in terms of the number of UI components.
Anybody
Mhm.
with at least a little bit of experimentation experience under their belt has seen like you have some big, huge, massive resource heavy change that you're testing. It took engineering 2 weeks to build that test together, and you had to do QA and all of this thorough stuff, and it takes you 2 months to build this test, and you're putting a lot of work on it. And then you have a test where it was like 3 lines of code. It took you 5 minutes to put together, and
Mhm.
the 5-minute test produced way more value than that big, expensive test that you ran.
Yeah. Sometimes they surprise you. Sometimes you make a change and you're like, this is not going to make any sort of difference. And then you look at the results and you're like, whoa, this changes everything. So I think it's really important to know in advance if what you're about to do is actually meaningful. And I think there are a few ways to predict that in advance. It's never going to be perfect. But I mean, yeah, a lot of change does not necessarily mean big change. Like, what if your most clicked button on your home page? What if you suddenly divert that from a product page for a one time purchase to a whole subscription flow? That's technically a tiny change. All you're doing is changing the URL of that button, but you're completely changing the whole experience for your customer, hypothetically.
You guys ever watched Fist of the North Star? There's a
No.
manga where he's like
I'm
this
yeah.
this hero guy who knew all of the pressure points to hit
Mhm.
to disable his opponents. So sometimes it'd be the tiniest moves to disable the opponents. So it's not necessarily, you could go in with a sledgehammer, but
Mhm.
you might not be able to cause any damage. But if you know the pressure points to
Yes.
prod, then you could get some sort of reaction. In this analogy, the website is your opponent, obviously. I'm not condoning you go out and attack people. There's one myth bust that I want to focus on that you touched on there, that there's the correlation between dev time and magnitude of change, magnitude of
Right.
result is a myth, basically,
Yeah.
because you could have a change that doesn't take much in terms of dev time, but the actual UI impact is pretty big. The impact at the end could be very big. I think it's really important, and we've spoken about it a lot before, is to track dev time, like how long it takes to develop a test. And then when you then track the dev time, you see something interesting happen when you look at the stats of your experiment program, because you can see, oh yeah, this test took half an hour to build, or half a day to build, or whatever, and this was our biggest win. So you could go by ranking your test by biggest win, and then seeing how much dev time was spent on that.
That must be kind of reflecting back on a test that's already been completed, but there's also so many things that you can do before the test is even developed or put into execution to kind of tell in advance, oh, okay, I thought this was going to be such a simple test, but our dev team just let us know, okay, this is going to take significant changes to the Shopify theme, for example, that you don't necessarily see because you don't work under the hood. So I think it's really important to engage your developers and your designers into the process as soon as possible, especially at the point of prioritizing tests, because then you're not going to be prioritizing something that's actually really high effort and just not worth sidelining the other problems you're looking to solve. And also, just before each test is actually executed on, are you doing a feasibility check with your development and design team? Is it even possible to
Mhm.
accomplish so that you're not halfway building a test and realizing
Mm,
this is actually a huge time suck and it's not worth the level of change that we're making here or the
Mhm.
specific change that we're making. I've had that happen to
Mhm.
me so many times, but that's also on tests where I didn't think it was a big change. It wasn't a big swing. I thought it was iterative, but turns out it was actually under the hood a nightmare for developers to work on.
a really good point, because there's you could go into it thinking that it's a small change, and then you actually realize that there's all sorts of other stuff that's actually changing behind the scenes
Yes.
that you're not factoring for in the test necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really
There's
good
a
point.
Yeah.
there's a difference between the 3-sentence test write-up and the level of
Yeah.
underlying complexity there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I had a test
Absolutely.
where we wanted to test increasing the number of um um product recommendations shown on the cart page from like 1 to 2 or
Mm,
to 4. And the question was like previously it was really straightforward, like one showing one upsell. There wasn't a lot of logic involved in that. And it was directly tied to like if like these it was a site that they only had about 30 products or so. So it was like really, like limited. And so it was like really easy correlation of like if this product is in the cart, like this is the
Mhm.
one that you want to show. But then all of a sudden you're showing 3 or 4. There's there's hidden complexity there of like, sure, I can write like it's one sentence of like we want to test showing 4 upsells in the cart. Okay, that's really easy to describe, but that's very complex to build because all of a sudden
Yes.
you're designing an algorithm to say which one should be shown in what situations. Like if this item's already in the cart, it shouldn't be shown as a recommendation. Like there's all this sophisticated underlying logic there from a seemingly simple request.
Mhm. Yeah. That's part of why I really like using the scoring system of iterative, substantive, disruptive. I know you folks have like
Mhm.
talked about this or at least brought it up as a
I
yeah,
stole it
like for
from
this
Spiro.
episode. Okay, so from
Uh,
Spiro. Okay.
so that's a really great segue into some nomenclature. What do we mean by iterative, substantive, and disruptive tests? Um,
Mhm.
my definition. Iterative are the smallest level of changes that you could do, like, for example, changing some headline text or something like that. Substantive is where you're basically changing something that's much more prominent, maybe design or something like that. Disruptive, which is not necessarily something big in terms of changing your whole website or whatever, but changing the way that your website comes across, like maybe
Mhm.
the whole sort of angle from which your website communicates to people is coming
Yeah.
from a different angle. So then
Yeah.
that's kind of like a disruptive test. It's kind of, really changing things up. Adding a new CTA, that's another type of disruptive test. This one, like if you add a new CTA that base to your site that didn't previously exist,
Yeah,
that's quite
these groups of, I guess,
yes,
measuring how much change is being made. I always struggled with knowing what qualifies as a substantive test. So that midway between iterative and disruptive, and what qualifies a disruptive test. And the thing that stood out the most to me, at least the most common difference between those types of tests, was, are you going to be making changes to the theme of the website? Are you going to need to install
mm,
new apps or make big modifications to how those apps work? To me, iterative is, you don't really need to do all that much on the back end. It's going to be very small changes that are like copy images, you just kind of swap them in and out. Substantive, yeah, you're doing some work under the hood that, and it's going to separate you from the iterative test. And just to kind of add to disruptive tests I typically saw were the ones that create big change in how a business model actually is set up. So usually
yes,
that's with like
yes.
subscription tests or creating new offerings. If you've never bundled products before, that's a disruptive test. So to me, I've encountered every single one of these tests, but the ones that I try to mix in most often are the iterative tests. And I'm sure we're going to get into why they're so popular.
Yeah.
But I actually have not found iterative tests are popular. I get a lot of crap for running iterative tests.
I've had like two fairly recent examples from two different clients. We'll
Mhm.
call them client A, client B. So client A was A/B testing rather than using the experimentation process. So they were thinking in terms of feature releases and stuff, and they just decided to A/B test those feature releases. Bundled into those were all sorts of assumptions and stuff like that. They got a good amount of traffic, but they're not learning anything. That was their problem. And then there was another client who really wanted to test iteratively. So they really wanted to test these small changes, but coming into that program with a history of other tests on that same site where small changes weren't having an impact. So we knew that we had to go much more disruptive, much bigger, sort of substantive sort of changes on the site. So basically there's not really one size fits all approach. It's kind of very, very much tailored to the context and the company and their goals and stuff like that. So it's really interesting that you have experience where basically you've been told off to go substantive rather than going iterative.
You never know what a client's gonna actually want. I appreciate either approach given that the resources are available, but I still, with every client, try to have a healthy mix between iterative, substantive, and disruptive. I've had clients who I ran a program for them just totally iterative and it didn't make a dent at all in their program because changes were so small. But then I've also
Mm,
had programs that failed because we we wasted all our resources on substantive or disruptive tests that we couldn't even end up getting live due to technical constraints that just weren't seen early on in the process. But then I've had clients who either of these approaches did work for them. You never know until you actually are in it. But I again, like I am more likely to have a client tell me we don't want to do iterative, we want to do big swings versus in the experimentation community, the popular advice is do iterative, do one change at a time, which I used to fully agree with, and I no longer agree with that.
There's a lot of nuance that gets lost in this. So any advice you give, if you had the people who want to test substantive and the people who want to test iterative in the same room, you'll end up agreeing with both, and you'll end up looking like, oh yeah, you don't know which one to pick. But in actual fact, it's much more of a nuanced sort of thing where you kind of go, okay, what's right for what we're trying to achieve. In terms of like testing big, there's lots of different reasons why you could test big. And it's important to know like what is your goal. So sometimes a goal could be we need to evolve the website design so then we can accommodate new features that we want to add. So then we're creating non-inferiority tests and we need to run fast. That's very different to kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and then seeing what sticks, sort of thing, to see like a crazy mad dash to get like a gold rush, get like conversion.
I think it's okay to make a lot of changes as long as the changes that you're making are all relevant to the same thing that you're trying to learn, the same thing that's
Right.
outlined in your hypothesis. Are you removing things that may actually be working for you and have nothing to do with the test just to, give something new and totally redesigned and fresh? If you're doing that, then I'd say you're no longer within your hypothesis. But if you're making a bunch of changes that are still relevant to what you're trying to prove or find out, hey, that's okay. You can still do research afterward, after the test results come through, to see is this actually working or did this have the opposite effect?
Yeah, and that's a really good important point as well, is that it's not one way or the other. Neither way is the right way or the wrong
Mm,
way. Like in the whole like, oh, test only one thing at a time camp. Like you can be absurdly reductive to like, well, what's your definition of one thing?
yes.
You know, say you're testing filters, like, oh, should they like be collapsed in an accordion or
Mhm,
expanded by default? Well, it's
mhm.
like, oh, there's 3 filters on this category page, but there's 5 filter clusters on this other category page. If you're
Yeah.
collapsing them all, are you collapsing 3 different ones at the same time? Like, you're like, you can
Mhm,
you can be you can be, like, ludicrous in, like, what your definition of one change is there.
mhm.
So, it's kind of like
Yeah,
the design needs to fit the hypothesis.
Yeah,
totally.
And also getting into like, what are the pitfalls of like only doing one way or the other? Like if you're only
Yeah.
doing iterative testing, you run the risk of hitting local maxima. Like you're optimizing to like this degree, whereas like there's some big change that you're not paying any kind of attention to. That would be a big pivot for the business, but that's going to get you up like 2, 3x better than where you are if you're only testing these small changes. And then vice versa,
Yeah.
if you're only testing big things, you're only swinging for the fences every time. Well, you're going to strike out a lot more often.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Totally. I
to
think
use a
one
baseball analogy for someone on the call that
yeah,
is in England and doesn't understand baseball at all, but
I don't understand baseball at all. I
I
don't
was just
understand
at a
any
baseball
sport.
game, I don't understand baseball.
I'm a huge baseball fan. I mean, I'm wearing a baseball T-shirt right now, so
Nice. Yeah, no, Matt, that whole analogy that you gave about filters, that's a really good example. I see one very interesting behavior sometimes. In an agency environment, you're exposed to so many different programs and so many different optimizers with different styles. And one thing that I've seen that always made me so nervous whenever I saw it was okay, so you have this filter test, and is your hypothesis to collapse the filters? Okay, so there's one variant that's just collapsing or not collapsing the filters. But then I'll notice sometimes a strategist will sneak in another variant that's like, oh, well, what happens if we collapse the variant and add more filters? So it's like all these
right.
extra
It's
changes are added on,
You're
but it's a
right,
different
that's when you're
hypothesis.
mixing things in. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, that makes me so nervous, and then also not considering, okay, you added another variant here, you're gonna make it really hard to reach your sample. assuming that, you're doing the
I've
work
had to
of
train clients off of that so
yes,
many times of like,
yes,
Thank you for the like Figma mockup that has 5 variations in it, but you only get 5,000 visitors a week on your
yes,
entire site, and this mockup is for the category page, which gets,
totally.
10% of your traffic. Like, this will never reach significance if we try to test 5 variations at the same time.
Totally. And I also notice if when you do that approach of adding on more variants, there's always a possibility that isn't captured in those variants. So in that example I just gave, technically, you look at your results, you wouldn't know how the test would perform on a variant that had a like non-collapsed filter with those new filters you added on. You're introducing way too many
Yeah.
possibilities, way too many things that can go wrong. To me, that is how to not do big swings. Do not use or variants as a stand-in for trying new things and making big changes, especially if it doesn't answer the original question that
Yeah.
you're trying to go for.
Well, that really gets back to the root of, like, how to formulate a test hypothesis, right?
Yes.
Like, first you have to have a problem that you have
Yes.
identified that you're trying to solve for, and then creating a goal for that of like, this is the thing that we want to try and accomplish. We think that this change will cause this result for
Yep.
these reasons. And
Mhm.
it right like having that strong foundation is what allows it to work regardless of the scale of the experiment itself.
Totally. Totally.
Something we've talked about previously of velocity for velocity's sake, like like more tests equals better when it's not always the case.
Mhm.
There was an analogy that I ran across very early on in my testing career that I stole from somewhere, and I've kept it because it's a useful way to phrase it, and it's like you're mining for diamonds, and
Mhm.
so like your big disruptive tests are mining for the diamonds. It's a bigger risk. It's going to be harder to accomplish. You're going to have a lot more failure and time and effort devoted to finding that one big thing that's worth a lot of value. But then the iterative testing layers in on top of that to like cut, polish the diamond. And that's what creates like its actual sellable value, right? Because there's a substantial difference in pricing between raw, uncut diamond directly from the mine versus one that a gemologist has applied their craft to. And
Mhm.
in testing, you can be applied the same way. Like those big disruptive changes, those are mining. Those are investigative processes. Those are almost like testing as research, where you're doing a lot of things and it may not directly pay off in terms of direct monetary value of like making a change that
Mhm.
results in a lift, but you're going to get a lot of information insight because you're doing a big change that is by definition disruptive, but you can observe that disruption and see what happens and then capitalize on, oh, this this secondary we saw a lift in this secondary goal that we were tracking. Maybe there's, layer to peel away on that. So now we have a new investigative avenue to focus our iterative testing efforts towards.
Mhm. I don't know why, but you just made me think of Titanic. Have you guys watched Titanic, like the 1997 one?
We watched that. I think everybody in the world at
I
this
think
point has
everyone's
watched
watched it,
it.
yes. Okay, so then you'll know what I'm about to say. They put so many resources into, the project to find the heart of the ocean, this, like, necklace worth millions and millions and millions of dollars, and they were probably finding a lot of valuable stuff in the meantime that just they were so tunnel visioned on finding this one jewel, they didn't find it. The old lady drops it in the ocean in the end, spoiler alert. But, like, you see how they're handling all the legal documents that come out of the safe that they thought the jewel would be in, and it's like, okay, in the process of trying to find the gem, how much did you actually not pay attention to that was also valuable that came out of your
Hmm.
search? So I when I see a testing program, I want to make sure that while I'm mining for that big multi-million dollar diamond, I'm also paying attention to the things that are a little smaller in scope, but can make just as much impact if it actually solves a problem.
Ah, that's good. We managed to get in Titanic and
Yeah.
Fist of the North Star in the same episode. I call that a
Yeah.
win. That's a really good analogy, though. It's like, yeah, yeah, you're kind of like going, oh, you probably threw away something that was more valuable than the gem itself at one point
Yes.
because you're so focused on
Exactly.
that gem.
In your
Exactly.
hunt for the $10,000 prize, you threw away the $5,000 prize.
Or
It's more
10
like,
$5,000 prizes. Yeah.
this gem was worth hundreds of millions, so a bit of a
I know.
difference, but,
Well, yeah, sure, but yeah,
Yeah.
no, but it's like it is so true, and I think that it is a myth that the more change you make, the more disruptive the test, the more impact it's gonna bring, and that is
yeah,
something that I'm constantly having to educate clients on is just because it's a big swing does not mean it's a better swing. Is it actually solving anything? And if the answer is no, well, then why are we doing it, and why is it taking priority? So, a healthy mix of
yeah.
those different types of tests is so important.
I used to actually keep score with a team that were always wanting to go big. And I actually
Mhm.
used to keep a score of how many of the big tests were wins, and that score was 0. So
Yeah.
so out
Yeah.
of what, like, 15, 16 of, like, really, really big tests.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so it used to be like going into a meeting, we're going, "Oh, yeah, we wanna do this big test." They're saying, "Are you sure? Because our success rate is 0." They're saying,
Mhm.
"Well, through random chance," and this was their argument, "through random chance, then the next one has to be a success." It's like, no, what it
Oh
proves is that
no, no, gambler's
you
fallacy.
actually
Come on.
yeah, yeah. Well, it actually proves that you actually don't know anything about your site, so therefore, you need to do some iterative testing to go for the big test. And
Yeah.
which brings us to, like, strategies and sort of ways in which you can kind of uh, test big and also test small and actually have them both exist without needing one or the other.
I've found it to be quite effective in those situations when I outline with a client right at the start of the engagement or the quarter the exact mix we're going to hit. So 50% of our tests will be iterative, and in the background, 30% will be substantive, 20% will be disruptive. So the client already knows, okay, we have one or two tests that we can use to disrupt. What are those going to be? And it helps simplify for them and also making sure that every test that I'm working on, I tag it. Is it iterative? Is it substantive or is it disruptive? So that way I can keep track of it. And then Iqbal, kind of what you did was you can actually look back and say, oh, all these disruptive tests, they 0% ended up being implemented or made a positive change. So that way you can reassess investment and return on investment and also just where you're putting your resources. Also, disruptive tests take so long sometimes to build that it is helpful to spend a longer period of time building them and working on them and still show the client you're putting iterative tests out there while it's being constructive, and you can keep that pace going on your program. You don't have to pick and choose. You can still do them all, but just being strategic about what am I launching while the more disruptive test is being built by the program.
Careful management of your bandwidth and resources there.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Um, I did want to like poke on that a little bit of like
Yeah.
absolutely it's important to have a healthy mix
Mhm.
there, but I uh like what you're saying, Iqbal, there around like, oh, we tracked this and zero of our disruptive tests ended up
Well,
winning.
not
So for any given hypothetical of like,
yeah, yeah.
say, this, that shouldn't necessarily dissuade you from doing those
True.
because how like also don't look at your tests in isolation either. Like
Mhm.
say you did like that big disruptive test, what was what was the causal chain that led out from that? Like, so say you did a
Good.
big disruptive test and it failed. Did you just completely abandon everything that you did related to that test? Like, oh, we tested this thing, it didn't work. We're never touching anything related to that ever again. Or more likely, there was probably something in there that said, let's go investigate this other, like, you probably learned something off of that that led to another test or
Absolutely.
hypothesis or bit of research, right? So, like, also establishing that, that chain of causation.
If you have a substantive test that doesn't win, you could go back and start to dissect what was tested and figure out what was causing the such and such an impact. So there's lots of different ways that you can kind of approach that sort of thing. So you can, if you want, if the goal is to evolve your website design, you could bundle in lots of, you know, meaningful changes. To your point, Tracy, that map to a specific hypothesis, so you're learning along the way. And then if you have a loss, then you can go back through, track everything up, metric the heck out of the test, and then figure out what do we think caused this impact, and then
Totally.
dissect that a little bit more. And then if you absolutely need to, then you can go back to iterative testing each one of those. And I think with that kind of mixture of, lots of changes and then removing those changes,
Mhm.
then testing each change separately, that's like a really good sort of way to kind of mix and kind of move quick perspective.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, and Matt, I totally agree that you can't just look at a single test in isolation. I don't
Yeah.
personally I don't believe in losses in experimentation. You really only lose like I don't know if this is actually a spicy
Not to
take or
soapbox a bit or anything on that
like it's
topic, but
no, but just truly, like, you don't actually lose unless you run a test, it tells you not to implement because it's a bad choice to do so, and you are stubborn and you implement anyway, that's a loss, and also, if you just don't try to learn from the results that you see, otherwise, it's either a flat result or a, like, astounding positive result, but I don't think that it's right to look at just tests in isolation and say, "Oh, this didn't work for us because it was like all disruptive tests don't work for us because those disruptive tests may have actually turned into substantive or iterative tests that did move the needle. You realize you didn't need to over engineer things. You just could do a simple tweak that isn't actually so small. It's not as much of a tweak as you thought it was going to be. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I definitely see that point and I agree with that point. I think it's important to just make sure that if you're putting a mix of different tests that you're actively reflecting on them. You're saying what do we do next? To me that is iterative. Whether it's a small change or not, it's looking back at what you're doing and saying what's the next step forward, which everyone's got to do.
I think the reason why Matt was laughing before when you mentioned the loss thing is one of his mottos is that it's not a loss, it's a save, and he's like he likes
It's
to bring
true.
it up every
that's a
single
that's a
time.
drum that I will beat all the
so,
time. Yeah.
I
so
agree. I totally agree.
yeah, and I just realized that it's really dark here, so I don't know if you
It
can
got dark
hear.
out quick for you, my
Yeah.
friend.
Yes,
That was
yes. You could
immediate.
see, like, in the midst of our conversation, it went from being really sunny to being pitch black, and I didn't realize that you're probably not gonna be able to see me. I'm probably just like a silhouette figure talking. Like one of those people in the, in crime films, they have to obscure their face and voice to protect their identity, like one of those guys, but yeah,
For
We could get
certain
the
CRO-related
anonymizing
topics, you
voice.
might have to do that.
I think that's gotta be our approach to kind of, like, disguise our identities so we can go super
Yeah.
spicy.
Yeah, anonymize
There
it.
So with doing, like, iterative testing, do either of you do anything where, like, to sort of evaluate, like, where you were versus where you are? Do you do anything around, like, bundling all of your changes together? Like, say you've had, like, a long series of incremental improvements over time from a bunch of iterative tests. Do you ever do something where like you roll all of those together into like a single disruptive test where it's like, here's all of the stuff that we learned over the last quarter versus like a holdout group that did not experience any of those changes, and you're saying like, like I'm gonna like prove all the stuff that I did for the last quarter or whatever, like has a cumulatively positive impact.
Oh, so is the test removing all of those changes to actually prove it made a
Well,
difference?
it would be dependent on, like, your
Yeah.
development engineering cycle and things like that, but, like, say, like, hypothetically, you
Yeah.
were, like, smart and you pre-planned everything out, and you were like, "We've reserved a certain percentage of users as a holdout group who will not experience any of, like, the deployed
Mm.
improvements that we make this quarter, and then we're gonna leave those to
I've
test
never done
them
that.
versus, like, here's." Yeah.
I've never done that. I guess if a client were really a pain in the ass and challenging me on the impact I made, maybe I would do that. But I can't say I've ever encountered a situation in which that was needed. Have you guys done that?
Not per
I've
se, but
I've kind of had to do that for some where basically we were replatforming. So the scenario is we were replatforming, and then there's some features that were expensive to build that were previously
Mhm,
tested. And so testing, just hiding those features, not exactly what Matt was saying, but kind of going back, removing some previous test wins.
mhm,
And we did find that removing those test wins had no impact because,
mhm.
the traffic evolves, users evolve, and the site has evolved and stuff like that. So, but yeah, but
Interesting.
nothing exactly like what you mentioned, man. I actually actively used to fight against that with teams that wanted to do that. But it was just basically it's a waste of time and resources. And
oh, do you
back
think it's more of like it's just like a navel gazing exercise?
you'd have to not release any of your A/B test wins into production, which I think would be a
Right.
mistake
Yeah, yeah,
because you
yeah.
want to
Yeah.
be putting them out as after you won a test, you need to be putting them out. So then, if you're bundling them all up, you've got a period where you're not where you haven't actually rolled out any of your test wins, and then all of a sudden you're putting everything out at the same time.
You wouldn't bundle all your saves together to see how much not worse off you
Yeah,
are. So,
just out of curiosity, I wonder how much we saved. Let's roll out all of our losses and then
yeah.
see what the yeah,
Really good idea.
yeah.
All right. Anything else to cover in terms of iterative, substantive, disruptive tests?
You just changed the subject of our entire talk from being about big versus small to being about iterative, substantive versus
Well, where we were versus where we are.
oh wait, this is where we are now.
Yeah. Talk like
There's
yeah.
there's
It's a good place to
definitely a
be
The
actually.
gradient
spectrum.
the gradient scale of testing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.